Hello everyone. What happens when a teenager leaves work and is never seen again? Well, today's case is just that, and it's one with very, very little information to go off of, and what we do know is very strange. Kimberly McAndrew was born January 17th of 1970 to her mother Audrey, who was a stay-at-home mom, and her father Cyril, who was an RCMP officer at the local Port Hawkesbury detachment, originally from Ireland. The family would live in the small community of Dundee, located in Richmond County on Cape Breton Island, and named after the city of Dundee in Scotland. The family consisted of 5 daughters, named Heather, Erin, Carla, Megan, and little Kimberly. In July of 1977, they'd welcome a son named James. In 1985, the family would move 3 hours away to the town of Parsborough. Audrey and the children went first, while Cyril stayed through the winter and then transferred to Halifax, commuting to Parsborough to be with his family. 4 years later, after 33 years of service, he retired in August of 1989. That same year, Kimberly was now a 19-year-old young woman living in Halifax and studying sciences at Dalhousie University while working as a cashier at a Canadian Tire located at 6203 Quinpool Road. She was described as a good girl that didn't hang out with a bad crowd and had no criminal history. She was said to be quiet while out in public, but around family and friends, she was very funny, goofy, and liked to make others laugh. She loved Bryan Adams and had a close group of friends that she kept throughout the years. In 1989, Kimberly was living in an apartment in Halifax, only a 15-minute walk away from her work. Her father would also occasionally come by and visit her. On August 12th of 1989, Kimberly spent the day at work doing her normal shift, and she was also looking forward to spending the evening with her boyfriend because it was his birthday. They also had plans to attend the Busters Festival. At 4:20 p.m., Kimberly's boss would end up letting her clock out early. Her shift usually ended at 5 p.m. After that, she walked out the door, excited for her plans. But then as 5 p.m. rolled around, her boyfriend would arrive at work to pick her up, but she was nowhere to be found. And he had actually just driven the same route that she would have taken to walk home, and he hadn't seen her the entire time. So he went and checked her apartment, but she wasn't at her apartment either. She would have only had the clothes on her back and a blue bag that she had been carrying back and forth to work. So it wasn't like she was prepared to go anywhere else. So after this, Kimberly would be reported missing. When police would look into her bank accounts, none of them had been touched and none of her credit cards had been used either. Then, a sighting would come in of Kimberly at a flower shop in Penhorn Mall in Dartmouth. She was identified by an employee at the flower shop as having bought a balloon and roses, but that just didn't make sense. Not only did police say she didn't use her bank account or credit cards, but it also would have taken her in about an hour and 40 minutes to walk to that location from her work, which was just something that she wouldn't have done. On top of that, she had been excited the entire day to spend the evening with her boyfriend. She even got off work early, so why would she spend the next hour to 2 hours knowing that her boyfriend was going to pick her up in about half an hour or so, walking all the way to this mall? She also wouldn't have gone anywhere out of the way like that without telling someone first. Her sister Megan would later tell a story about how when they were living in Parsborough, Kimberly wouldn't even walk to the downtown area by herself to buy a Diet Coke. She always made Megan tag along with her. She wasn't the kind of girl that would wander off alone or run away. What I found odd is that in a newspaper from the Toronto Star in December of 1989, it reads as if Kimberly willingly went to the mall to buy her boyfriend these gifts of balloons and a rose. It didn't depict it as if it was strange, which is how I see it presented now. On top of that, it is a little weird that a girl would be buying a rose for her boyfriend for his birthday. Usually it's something, a guy would buy a girl, especially in the 80s, I feel like. Unless I guess he was obsessed with flowers or she was trying to break the gender norms or something back then, but it just didn't seem like something that would happen, especially back in the 80s. But what really is strange to me is how it was depicted back in that year she went missing, how it was not odd that she would have walked an hour and 40 minutes all the way to this mall and then bought these gifts. Unless she had a vehicle she drove that is just not talked about, because I didn't see that talked about, especially since she lived within walking distance of her work and it talked about how she could walk to work. Over the years, searches would be done on various properties, some of which were Point Pleasant Park, Sir Stanford Fleming Lake, and Shad Bay. Cyril would spend every day of his retirement searching for his missing daughter, which has to just be even more so heartbreaking. Someone being in law enforcement and then your child goes missing and you can't find them despite all of the resources and the training you probably have. And eventually Cyril would unfortunately be diagnosed with cancer, and even then he was still searching. He was still determined to continue. Meanwhile, police were amassing piles of paperwork, interviewing more than 500 people, using tracking dogs, and even enlisting psychics as a last resort. You hear psychics being used a lot in these older cases. They even went as far as investigating the chance of Kimberly being trafficked and abducted into a prostitution ring. The family would also issue a $10,000 reward. When it came to Kimberly's disappearance, money wasn't an issue with this police department in trying to find her, unlike some other cases we talk about. This time, it was the fact that they had hardly any information, no witnesses, no evidence, no leads. There was just absolutely nothing. It's as if she walked out the door of Canadian Tire and just vanished. And since it was the 80s, I'm guessing there wasn't any surveillance footage on the Canadian Tire anywhere around that they were able to capture what happened to her after she left, what direction she may have gone. In 1991, Child Find Nova Scotia would report that Kimberly had been found alive and well. A TV station would quote sources saying that Kimberly had had a baby in a London, Ontario hospital. Police would immediately look into this claim, but they would end up determining that it was a case of mistaken identity. The young woman apparently did look like Kimberly, and she actually had the same birthday, but she wasn't Kimberly. Police saying, quote, "We have interviewed the young woman who was in the hospital at that particular time, and no one interviewed her about being Kimberly McAndrew. She has no idea how it got started." End quote. All of this was, of course, extremely disappointing to Kimberly's family, who thought that she had been found. It was just very irresponsible on the behalf of this newspaper and these newscasts to be putting out information like that with absolutely no backing to it, before the police had even investigated the lead, and it got the family's hopes up. It was very irresponsible on their parts. In fall of 1995, a prisoner in Canada would claim to have gotten to know Kimberly after he'd shopped at her work often, and he would claim that Kimberly had disappeared after some of his friends had given her a drive. He claimed that he was with them when his friends killed Kimberly and then they buried her body in a Halifax park. But police would look into this lead, they would search the park, and they would end up finding nothing. This would lead investigators to question 4 unnamed individuals: a woman in Halifax, a man in Montreal, a woman in Toronto, and another man in Halifax. Police would say that they still lacked a body or credible evidence, so they couldn't place any charges. It was also mentioned again at this point that police were theorizing that Kimberly might have been abducted by pimps who had forced her into a prostitution ring, and that 2 men had recently been questioned that were connected to this pimping trade. But just a year later, in 1996, this prisoner would reveal that he had lied about all of that. He lied about his friends picking up Kimberly and murdering her, burying her in the park, and all the individuals that the police spent all of that time questioning. All because he wanted revenge against those individuals because they had lured his sister into prostitution. I'm all for getting revenge against evil people like that, especially if they did lure his sister into prostitution and were trafficking her. However, I don't know why he dragged this innocent family through all of this and wasted police resources and tax dollars looking in a direction that had nothing to do with Kimberly. They wasted a better half of a year, it seems like, looking into this, and it was all a lie, when they could have been actually looking into what happened to Kimberly. In 2002, remains would end up being found along Highway 101, but it was determined that those remains were not Kimberly's. Tim Martin, who is a cold case expert and retired police detective, has been stumped over Kimberly's disappearance, but has also followed it over the years. He's convinced that whatever happened to Kimberly happened in the Canadian Tire parking lot. Tom would say, quote, "I think that it could have been anyone's daughter. That's what makes this case so bothersome to me. She was not adventurous, and for her to go to Dartmouth on her own would have been an adventure. And that's just not what Kim would have done when she had plans that evening." End quote. Kimberly's sister Megan would also be interviewed in 2014, saying, quote, "If Kim is not living anymore, then we still want to find her. There's still the 19-year-old we miss terribly and want to know what she would be like today. Would she have children? Would she have gotten married? She's still my sister no matter what. Do I expect to open the door and have her walking through it? Probably not. But she's still very much a part of our family and still very much a part of all we do. We're a big family, and every one of us carries her with us. We're pleading with anyone that may have information, if they haven't come forward before, or if they have come forward and felt police didn't look into it as perhaps they thought they might, to call police and to call again and help us find what happened. We deserve to know, and she deserves to be found." End quote. Which is a very powerful statement and something that I often say in these videos. If you know something, please say something. Now let's talk about some theories and suspects, because that is honestly all the information we have. However, when I started digging into the theories and suspects, there seemed to be quite a few considering the lack of information. One suspect would come up that was very, very strange. Now, I couldn't find his name, but inside of his apartment, pictures of Kimberly were found displayed. If I end up finding his name or picture, I'll put it up on the screen. A blue knapsack would also be found inside of his apartment, but no charges were ever laid. One theory that floated around was that a rogue cop in uniform offered Kimberly a ride home, and she accepted since she felt comfortable because her father was a police officer. Maybe she even knew this officer. A serial killer named Michael Wayne McGray has also been a long suspect in Kimberly's disappearance. Michael was born on July 11th of 1965 and would have been in his mid-20s when Kimberly disappeared. He was born in Collingwood, Ontario, but raised in Argyll, Nova Scotia. On May 1st of 1985, Michael would murder 17-year-old hitchhiker Elizabeth Gale Tucker in a wooded area near Weymouth, Nova Scotia. Elizabeth's body would be found on October 6th of 1985 by a hunter with his dog on a logging road near Grosses Caucus. That same year, on September 3rd of 1985, 15-year-old Kimberly Amira would last be seen at the St. John exhibition in St. John, New Brunswick. That day, Kim, her sister, and friends went to the St. John exhibition and had an exciting, fun evening. Kim's sister would end up leaving early, but she decided to stay back with friends and watch the fireworks. After this, she would seemingly vanish. Michael would later claim to have kidnapped her and murdered her, burying her body on the Kingston Peninsula. A thorough search of the land would turn up no sign of Kim's burial site, so it's unclear if he was responsible for her disappearance. On November 14th of 1985, Michael, along with two accomplices named Mark Gibbons and Norm Warren, would rob a taxi driver in St. John. After police arrived, Mark's dead body would end up being found at Market Square. Norm would end up being charged for Mark's murder. However, a jury would find him not guilty. Michael would end up receiving a 5-year prison sentence for his participation in the robbery. However, he was also not charged in connection to Mark's death. In 1991, Mark was still serving time in prison from his 1987 robbery conviction. However, he ended up being given a 3-day weekend pass to stay at a halfway house in Montreal, Quebec during the Easter weekend, which, wild to me that prisoners could get that and just be let out into the public. And I guess you could see where this may be going. On March 30th of 1991, Mark met Robert Asali in Montreal's Gay Village. Robert would invite Michael back to his apartment, where he ended up being fatally stabbed in the throat and chest multiple times. March 31st, Michael would return to the Gay Village and met Gaithan Ethier, who also invited Michael back to his apartment. After spending the night at Gaithan's apartment, Michael also stabbed Gaithan to death. After this, he would flee, but he would be found 2 months later, and he would be rearrested, but not rearrested for murder because he hadn't been connected to any of these murders yet, it seems. Instead, he was just arrested for skipping out on his 3-day freedom pass. On the morning of February 28th of 1998, Joan Hicks and her 11-year-old daughter Nina would be murdered in their apartment. Joan would be found lying on the floor of her bathroom in a pool of blood. She'd been beaten, strangled, and her throat cut with a serrated knife. Her daughter Nina would be found hanging by a rope in her closet after she had been strangled by that same rope. Michael would end up being identified as a witness, and he would be arrested the next day. He'd later confess to those 2 murders of those 2 men in Montreal as well. Michael would go on to confess that he killed at least 11 people across Canada, including Halifax, St. John, Montreal, Ottawa, Toronto, Calgary, Vancouver, as well as Seattle, Washington. He claimed that he would provide the information of his other murders to authorities if his demands were met. In the end, he would only be charged with 6 murders and then a 7th after he killed his cellmate. So as you can see, this man is a serial killer. And we wonder why there are so many unsolved cases, and then we see people like this who went undetected for so long, and then he slipped up in one case, a witness saw him, and then he comes out and confesses to all these other murders. It's scary to think that these kind of people are just walking our streets. But he also had other victims, including people who were still alive. Because in a tragic turn of events, a man named Glenn Sound would spend 17 years in prison, claiming innocence after he'd been convicted of killing his girlfriend Brenda all the way back in 1995, after she was found dead with her neck slashed. Glenn's conviction would finally be overturned in 2019 after the Nova Scotia Supreme Court announced that they thought Michael was now their prime suspect. So to think that he left not only a trail of bodies, but then also other people were getting pinned for his crimes and then spending decades of their lives in prison is just so sickening. So All of that is to say, there was an active serial killer in the area when Kimberly went missing. And Michael claimed he had many other victims, so could Kimberly have been one of them? Another very sick individual that was investigated during that time period as well was a man named Andrew Paul Johnson, who was a convicted sex offender with a lengthy history of SA, violence, and criminal behavior. In 1997, Andrew would flee a sex offender treatment program in Halifax after several women, including his wife, told the court about his pattern of sadistic SA. After fleeing Nova Scotia, he would travel across the entire country, all the way to British Columbia, seeking out his wife, who had fled across the country there, thinking she would be safe away from this freaking man. But then he went and escaped this treatment program and went all the way there to find her. That is horrifying. Meanwhile, police in Nanaimo, BC would receive reports of a man who had tried twice to lure 12-year-old girls to his vehicle, pretending to be a police officer. This vehicle was described as a Grand Dam with Nova Scotia license plates. And this man, unsurprisingly, would turn out to be Andrew. And police would end up capturing Andrew while he had a 20-year-old woman locked in the back of his car. They caught him with a woman he had kidnapped. And when they would end up searching his vehicle, they would find what they described as an R-word kit in there, an SA kit, which comprised of porn mags, a Halloween mask, handcuffs, a meat cleaver, lube, and packing tape. How many times could I say that these men are horrifying? To think that there's individuals out there driving around with R-word kits. One psychiatrist who ended up speaking with Andrew described him as having a volcanic sexual appetite. Another would reveal that he had written an essay about the SA and murder of Kimberly McAndrew. A task force would be created after all of this to investigate 15 plus unsolved cases in the Halifax area. A property owned by Andrew and his brother in the Shad Bay, Nova Scotia area would also be extensively searched. However, no evidence ended up being found. Apparently, police also consider him a suspect in 2 other murders, but they also don't have enough evidence to convict him in those murders either. Sadly, Kimberly's father would pass away in September of 2004 without getting any answers on what happened to his daughter. Again, considering his background and being an RCMP officer, I can't imagine how frustrated he must have been over the years. Family would say, quote, "It absolutely haunted him that he was not able to find her, to save her, to protect her from whatever that was. That was something that never, ever left him." End quote. In more recent times, in 2024, the Halifax Regional Police would say, quote, "We hope the passage of time will encourage them to do the right thing and share what they know to police. It is never too late to come forward, and the smallest piece of information may be just what is needed to progress the investigation into Kimberly's disappearance." End quote. Kimberly's disappearance is definitely a very deep, deep mystery, especially considering the lack of information here. The fact that we don't even know if she was kidnapped from the parking lot of that Canadian Tire or in a mall that was in a whole different town next to where she was last seen is actually very scary. It's honestly one of the most puzzling pieces in this case. And something that I continue to wonder that I haven't seen clarified is that if she was at that mall and bought that rose and those balloons, did she pay with cash then? Because according to police, her bank accounts hadn't been used. So if the cashier said she used a card, then it would make me think that that wasn't her and that was just a case of misidentification, which I think is something vital to know, because then we would know for sure that she was last seen at her work, walked out the door, and so maybe she went missing nearby there. With such little information, it's hard to say if a serial killer like Michael McGray or a predator like Andrew did something to her. Although I do find it very, very interesting that both of them operated in the Halifax area. They both seem to have multiple victims. But the fact that Andrew was caught pretending to be a police officer and trying to lure off children, it really, really sways me to that theory that a fake police officer could have convinced Kimberly to get into his vehicle. And Kimberly may have felt comfortable because her father was a police officer. Although when you think about Michael McGray, he doesn't seem to have a pattern of victims. He doesn't seem to stick to a certain victim profile. It seems like he went to the gay village and killed gay men. He also went and killed a mother and her daughter. He has this very wide range of victims that could be his. Whereas with Andrew, he seems to be a sexual predator. He likes to SA, he carried around that R-word kit, and if anything, I think he might be better for this than Michael McGray would be, especially if he was pretending to be a police officer and she felt comfortable and got in, and then God knows what he would have done to her. She was a young, pretty girl who seemed to be very trusting, and she was just so excited to spend the rest of her day with her boyfriend and have a great evening. And to think that it was her boyfriend's birthday and that his girlfriend went missing on his birthday, that has to just ruin all birthdays. Honestly, I can't imagine her boyfriend as well. You know, family and friends are also victims in these cases. This is just an awful one, and it's such a confusing one because there is such little information. Now, as a little sneak peek, the next video coming out is actually going to be connected to Kimberly McAndrew, because there was another young woman who would also disappear from Halifax within a similar time frame, and she also has similar suspects in her case, including Andrew. And I found her case while I was covering Kimberly's, and I fell down the rabbit hole of that case, and I just needed to cover it as well because this girl also needs to be found, obviously. So it's going to be kind of a continuance of Kimberly's disappearance, but with a whole different person. And her disappearance also has similar aspects to it. So take a guess down below what that case may be. And I also want to know what you think about Kimberly's case. Do you have any more information that I didn't find and talk about here today? Let's chat about it down below. I'll be down there chatting with you all. And as I always say, if you know something, say something. Kimberly's family is slowly getting older, and some of them are already passing away, and they all deserve answers. They need to know what happens before they also pass on. Kimberly deserves to be found. So let's take one more good look at Kimberly. Kimberly is described as a white female standing 5'3" to 5'5" inches tall, around 110 to 134 pounds, with brown shoulder-length hair with bangs and blue eyes. She had a slight scar on the bridge of her nose and dental braces. She was last seen wearing a cotton, oversized blue navy sweater or cardigan, a white Esprit t-shirt with red and green squares, pleated ankle-length navy blue pants with slash pockets on the front and one pocket in the back, as well as jade green flat-heeled slip-on loafers. If you have any information, I'll have the authorities to contact down below. My heart goes out to the family. I hope they get answers soon. And as always, I hope you all stay safe out there, lock your windows and doors, and I hope to see you in the next video.